I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, the death of veteran Al Jazeera reporter and journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, shot and killed during an operation in the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank on May the 11th. And as of the time of the taping of this program, who shot Abu Akleh is still unknown. Israel saying it was likely Palestinians, the Palestinians blaming Israel. Again, the incident took place in Jenin, where most of the Palestinian terrorists who carried out a slew of recent deadly attacks on Israel came from. And the IDF was searching for more terror suspects when they came under fire and returned fire. A gun battle ensued. Abu Akleh, on the scene as a member of the press, was hit. Israel expressed sorrow over her death and is conducting a thorough investigation to find the truth. Well, to discuss what happened, the investigation, and how the tragic event is being portrayed in the media and beyond, is Managing Director of the Jerusalem Post, David Brinn, joining us from Jerusalem. David, thank you so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure, Teisha. Thanks.
So, David, you wrote a piece in the Jerusalem Post just after this happened, and you write, I'm quoting you, "What we know is that Al Jazeera veteran journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in Jenin during a shootout between IDF troops and Palestinian gunmen. How Abu Akleh died depends on how one feels about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict." What do you mean by that, David?
Well, in the few hours after her death, it seemed like everybody on social media anyway started to tweet and post information, videos, anything about the incident. And those who thought that Israel was to blame, basically convicted and sentenced Israel. And those that thought the Palestinians shot her posted videos, posted tweets saying, Israel couldn't have done it deliberately. They posted videos showing Palestinians running down an alley saying, we shot someone, and use that as evidence that they indeed killed her. And basically it was just like a race to see who could blame who first. So that's what I meant by that.
And her death almost got lost in that.
For sure. I mean, it was a tragic death. I mean, I just want to say condolences to her friends and family. She was a veteran journalist. A lot of people knew her in the media around Jerusalem and Israel. But yes, I think I have to say, especially on the Palestinian side, they tried to exploit it as quickly and as much as possible for their aims of demonizing Israel. And to a great extent, they succeeded. The headlines around the world that morning were Al Jazeera says Israel kills journalists. That's as opposed to a journalist killed in investigation going on.
Right. And you mentioned social media. I mean, it was like an immediate bombardment of hate, of accusations of blame on Israel. And beyond that, some tweets of note, I will just mention a member of the US Congress, Rashida Tlaib, writing very blatantly as if this is a fact, right? Stating as a cold, hard fact, she wrote, Abu Akleh was murdered by Israel, basically. Abu Akleh was murdered. Actress Susan Sarandon wrote, again, as if it is plain fact that has already been investigated when nothing of the sort has happened yet, stated that Abu Akleh was executed by Israeli snipers. This was a statement of fact. These are people who have many followers, who have, certainly a congresswoman stating something as fact is irresponsible, to say the least. And I'll just read Israel's ambassador to the US, Michael Herzog, responded to Tlaib's tweet. He wrote, "One would expect a member of Congress to support our call for an impartial joint Israeli-Palestinian investigation on this tragic event," which we'll talk about in a minute, David, "rather than rushing to a biased conclusion. Acting as the judge, jury, and executioner undermines the causes of justice and peace." How do you feel about those tweets that we've seen?
Right, you mentioned those two, Tlaib and Susan Sarandon. I know Amnesty International also tweeted something where they just wrote, I think, "end the occupation." They repeated it a number of times. They also pretty much convicted and sentenced Israel. I think I think it sort of fits the narrative. I think there are people who believe in a narrative that Israel is the occupier, and whatever happens in the area they occupy, they're to blame for. And Shireen's death fit right into that narrative, which is like sort of a colleague of mine, Seth Francis, wrote this, sort of like a train going down the track. And this one just like passenger got on, and it fit perfectly. And regardless of who is to blame for her death, Israel is guilty. That's their thinking.
And honestly, David, I feel like it in the Palestinian community, or there are many who it really won't matter at the end of the day whose bullet it was, because even if it ends up being a Palestinian bullet, I think the narrative will be, well, what choice did the Palestinian, we were in Jenin, we had to open fire on IDF soldiers. We wouldn't be in that situation if it wasn't for Israel, as you said. So I think regardless, this is going to be blamed on Israel. The truth is, I mean, obviously it's extremely important to get at the truth of what happened.
Right.
Certainly in the world.
The headlines on the first day are what make the impact, what make the impression. So yeah, like you said, even if there is an investigation, which the Palestinians have prevented, and it proves that they were to blame, it won't matter a bit in the historic sense or the public opinion sense, because that story is going to be buried somewhere. It's not going to be covered with the same intensity that her death was, and the blame of Israel was. So it's sort of like the ship has sailed, basically, as far as historically Israel will always be to blame for her death.
But of course, it is extremely important that this investigation does happen, and that certainly for Israel's relationship with the United States, who's calling on a thorough investigation, and I believe there is some cooperation happening, or at least there was an invitation to Washington to be a part of the investigation. As you mentioned, the Palestinian Authority, as of now, has refused to cooperate, has refused to hand over. I believe Israel wanted the bullet, to examine the bullet, to do forensic tests, and on the helmet as well, and that's all been refused, as far as I understand.
Right. So I think as of now, there is no way to determine the actual cause of her death, who was responsible for that bullet. As you mentioned, Israel right away, Foreign Minister Lapid and Defense Minister Gantz offered the Palestinians a joint investigation to come to the bottom of it, and they rejected it. Her funeral is taking place now. I think they put in Jerusalem. Just initial reports, it was the largest outdoor funeral in East Jerusalem that's ever been seen, apparently, and there have been clashes with the Israel police. And I don't know the details, so I really can't comment, but I know it's going to look terrible for Israel, because I just, the video I saw was the police pushing back against the mourners who were carrying the casket almost falling over. I don't know the cause of that, but again, it's another, there'll be another headline today that Israel, attacks funeral goers. But so it's another incident that Israel is going to have to stand up to.
And we just want to note that, yes, today was her funeral. We're taping this on Friday, May the 13th. Right. And again, it is so, it's a tragedy again, because mourning her death should be the focus of today. And as you said, it will become something else. And I was just reading as well that there were some, 10,000 people accompanying the funeral, and there were riots and rocks being thrown and chants and flags being flown and Israeli flags being ripped down near the Jaffa Gate. And police. But it
seemed like it turned into an anti-Israel rally, it seems. But again, it's too early to really comment on that. But yes, her death has been exploited to the maximum by the Palestinians and their supporters. Yes. And
it is really such a shame. And as someone who works in the media, how do you navigate through these situations and try and figure out a way to portray the whole picture of what is actually happening, and sort of, up against this portrayal of Israel in most of the media? How do you, as a journalist, as a veteran journalist in this field, deal with that?
Well, I mean, I think probably it's trying to present the bigger picture. I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, why the Israeli army was in Jenin in the first place. Jenin has been a hotbed of terrorism for a long time, but for the last few weeks in particular, there have been over almost 20 Israelis who have been killed in terror attacks in the last couple of months, and most of the perpetrators came out of Jenin. So the IDF was in Jenin conducting an operation, which evidently must have been very important. So that, I think, you have to explain those things. And basically, it's a war. It's a war between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, sometimes it's on low simmer, sometimes, but there is a war, and in war, bad things happen. Innocent people die, journalists die. And I think it's the reality that we have to accept. The fact that this incident took place, in a high-profile journalist was killed, tragically killed, just makes it all the more terrible, and it makes it all the more, more emphasis on Israel being the source of all the conflict. But I think trying to explain the situation in the context is an important part of what a journalist should do. So that's what we try to do at the Jerusalem Post, is not just give the sliver actually what happened, but try to present the larger context of how this went down and why it might have gone down, and what are the possible avenues of how it happened. And clear, as of now, there's still no results. We don't know who. The IDF has conducted preliminary, investigation. They've questioned all the soldiers who were in the area at the time, and they were in the area. And I think they found until now that none of the soldiers had fired their weapons during the time that she was shot. It doesn't mean, obviously, it's not conclusive. And one of the soldiers testifying said that at that same time, there were hundreds of Palestinians were firing hundreds of bullets around that area. So again, it's he said, she said at this point, and we don't have an answer.
And it's very tricky, as you said. Jenin this was a war zone situation, and you're also talking about, urban warfare. It's a very tricky situation for the IDF to go into Jenin. It's not something they choose to do that frequently, but in light of all these terror attacks that have happened over the last few weeks, it was a necessity. It's always a huge risk and a huge danger because, again, you're talking about being in alleyways and in between buildings, and it's very, very complicated. And of course, not to diminish any loss that happens in this situation, but to get a good understanding of the situation, why the IDF was there. And again, the IDF shared video of Palestinians firing. They emphasized indiscriminately, just shooting, wildly shooting, running and shooting. It's hard to, seemingly likely that one of those bullets could have hit her. But again, they're really trying to examine where she was, where the IDF was, what are the possibilities, and to look at it realistically.
Right. And I think I'd like to interject something that I think a lot of what you mentioned before, what Rashida Tlaib and Susan Sarandon and others have written, sort of implies that the IDF deliberately shot her and killed her, which, I think the plausibility of that being true is minute. I mean, anyone who knows how the army works knows that the chances of that happening are very, very slim. She might have been hit in crossfire by the IDF, and that's a tragic accident. But I think it's very, it's over the top to claim that the Israeli army deliberately targeted her and assassinated her.
Absolutely. And, just getting back to those tweets for a minute, it's one thing to express your opinion, how you feel about Israel. And it's another to blatantly state a fact that has no evidence, no investigative results. And as you said, to jump from Israel is responsible because they were there and it was a gun battle, to say that Israel deliberately murdered this woman is truly, it's so dangerous, really, to say something like that in the already inflammatory situation that exists.
Right. And I saw in the response to my story, which was on Twitter as well, some of the responses just, are also just said, we're so blatantly anti-Israel and already convicting and sentencing Israel for the act. There was no room to even question the possibility that something else happened besides Israel deliberately targeting her and killing her.
Can you share some of those responses with us? Just give us an example. And were these people in Israel or outside of Israel?
It's hard to say. I mean, so many Twitter handles, you don't know who they are. They're not real names, they're avatars, and they're not. But it's just like I can't even think of one particular. But it was calling Israel Nazis, war criminals. This justifies Israel's not being in existence. Going basically that just this incident Israel is the reason for all the world's ills, basically. Just an example. Which you should never read the talkbacks to stories in tweets. That's the conclusion of that.
That's the lesson. Right. But it's tough because your piece really did not even take a side. It was just looking at how the story was sort of being taken.
Right.
And manipulated and exploited. You really don't take a particular side, but just the fact that you wrote something.
Right. And I think they see Israel as the occupier, and as the occupier, they are guilty of the shooting. There's no question. It's difficult and impossible to reason and have a normal discussion or reasonable argument with people like that who already have their preconceived notions, like you, the tweets that you mentioned, that there's no other possibility that besides Israel being to blame.
I want to mention one response to, I think it was to the Susan Sarandon tweet from the CEO of the American Jewish Committee, David Harris, called it a blood libel. Mm-hmm. He said again, she stated, Abu Akleh was executed by Israeli snipers as if, they were waiting, saw her and deliberately killed her, which, as you said, is certainly almost impossible and just such an inflammatory, insightful statement.
Right.
Inciting statement.
Yes. Yeah. And I think now she has already become a symbol of the occupation. And I think it will continue to grow, just like the young Gazan boy who was killed during the Second Intifada, Muhammad al-Qadir, I think his name is. I think remember that, but he was caught in a crossfire and Israel was to blame, and it's many years of investigating. And it doesn't really matter who shot him, whether the Palestinians or Israelis, but he's a symbol for Palestinians ever since. And I think Shireen will be like that as well.
And I just want to mention, we are taping this on Friday, and there was just a report that IDF soldiers had to go into Jenin again today. And unfortunately, I believe he was a commander, was seriously injured, and he just died of his injuries. So this is a war zone. This is an extremely dangerous area.
No, for sure. Yeah, that's, the fact that the IDF went back into Jenin 2 days after the incident with Shireen shows that there either are ticking bombs there, terrorists who are about to go off on missions, information that the IDF has, or some other, information that makes being there urgent and very unfortunately resulted in the death of an IDF officer. But over the last couple of months, as I mentioned, there have been numerous terror attacks in Israel, and almost a couple of dozen Israelis have lost their lives. And I haven't seen any outcry to the extent that amongst the world and the media and celebrities when those innocent Israelis were deliberately killed, as opposed to accidentally killed, that we've seen with Shireen.
Yeah, I want to read something that actually the editor of the Times of Israel, David Horowitz, wrote. He said, getting to the bottom of what happened, be it exculpatory or problematic, won't alleviate Palestinian hostility, reverse closed-minded conclusions, or sweep aside mis and disinformation, but it will make a considerable difference for those at home, abroad, in governments, and among ordinary people for whom the truth does still have a lasting value.
No, he's definitely right. I mean, as I said, it may not matter that Israel will always be to blame and always be guilty for the people who hate Israel. But yes, to get to the bottom of this and find out and to punish those that were responsible, if it turns out that Israel was responsible, is very important. And in any democracy, that's the litmus test, I believe.
Absolutely. David, I want to just ask you, as a journalist, when you read about what happened to Shireen, just as a member of the press yourself, how did this impact you?
I felt terrible as an Israeli, as a human, as a journalist, as a colleague of hers, even though I never met her. It's always tragic when a journalist gets killed. I know in the Russian-Ukraine war, there have been a number of journalists who have died. I have not been in war zones very much myself as a journalist here, but I know that there are journalists who go in, day out into the West Bank, into areas where there are potential clashes between the IDF and the Palestinians, and they're very brave. It's part of their job, and it's always horrible when something like this happens. And my heart goes out to her and her family.
I want to read one more thing that you wrote, that you mentioned in your piece before I let you go. You mentioned taking the advice of Israel's former ambassador to South Africa, Arthur Lenk, who tweeted, "I have no idea who killed Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. You don't either. Let's find a real, independent, quick investigation to avoid her tragic death becoming another source of conflict, and all commit to respecting findings." And you write, "That would be the most appropriate memorial to a journalist who was killed doing her job. Unfortunately, the manic taking of sides between supporters of the Palestinians and of Israel has made the circumstances of her death more important than her memory."
Right, and as we've seen today, unfortunately, with her funeral, that scenario is playing out again, as opposed to burying her in dignity. It turned into a riot and more clashes between Israel and the Palestinians. Unfortunately, that seems to be the reality here, and it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. We can only hope that we get to the bottom again, but when we get to the bottom of this, it's really not going to make a difference, because it's pretty much has been framed as her being killed by Israel, and that's the way it'll be perceived, as this conflict keeps on going down the tracks.
And at the same time, as you mentioned, the truth is important. It is certainly important, for U.S.-Israel relations, for world opinion. And as you said, also to show that, hopefully Israel was not to blame, but if it was in this crossfire and it was an Israeli bullet, that people will be held to account, that Israel conducts itself as a democratic society with rules and laws, and that there is this thorough investigation that is being conducted. Perhaps the Palestinians will cooperate. Can the truth be found without the cooperation of the Palestinian Authority at this point, do you think? Or is that going to be a really difficult thing to get past, not having the actual bullet, not having the helmet? What do you think?
Right. I think it'll be very difficult. I mean, I think, as I said, the IDF can conduct its own investigation of all the troops that were there, the whole, their where they were stationed, what they were doing, checking their magazines, bullet-wise. But I don't think the world will accept that as their final conclusions if Israel says, no, we weren't to blame, unless the Palestinians are involved in it too. And it seems like they have no interest in coming in finding the truth out about what happened here this week.
David, I hope we do get to the truth, and I truly thank you for giving us your time and your insight today. David Brinn is managing editor, of the Jerusalem Post. Thank you so much, David. Be well.
My pleasure. Take care. Nice to see you.
And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, managing director, Dara Golub, technical manager, Michael Paley, transmissions manager, John McDevitt, and to our producer, Carol Lilienthal. And thank you for watching In the News.